Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be here, although virtually. It's always a great pleasure always to talk about Newman. So I want to say that tonight I'm going to talk about a friend and not just a saint and a master. So I think that we were talking with Stefan before. My friendship with Newman started about 10 years ago with the beatification. And in a sense, tonight I'm going to share my journey of friendship together with Newman. And to do that, I'm going to start with something very different, which seems unrelated, but will not be unrelated. And this is from an American writer who is called David Foster Wallace, who committed suicide a few years ago. He was a brilliant writer. And one of the things he did, he gave a speech, which then became a book, which is called This is Water. And in this speech, he tells a very short story, which I think has a lot to do with Newman.
Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other's an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost, and I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard, and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. Well, then you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are, alive. The atheist just rolls his eyes. No, man, all that was a couple Eskimos happened to come wandering by and they showed me the way back to camp. It's easy to run the story through a kind of standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two totally different things to two different people, given those people's two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true and the other guy's is false or bad.
And I think that this little story that we just heard somehow sums up all the drama of modernity, which started, we will say, from the 16th, 17th century and reached its apex, its climax at the end of the 20th century. And David Foster Wallace is indeed the writer of the end of the 20th century, which committed suicide. And somehow I will draw an analogy between this, I will draw a connection between this position towards reality and his final decision. And I do think that this little story sums up, if you want, the whole drama of modernity, as I said. And I think this is your drama, it's my drama, which can be summed up with the idea that the reality and the meaning of reality in general cannot be known with certainty. Things happen, but we cannot really understand the meaning of what happens with certainty. Things great and small can happen in our lives. We can gaze at our natural world, at the beauty of nature, at the mystery of the universe. We can meet people different and also similar to us. We can experience strong feelings and strong desires, fear, but then happiness, beauty, pain. But in general, the meaning of all this remains always somehow fleeting and elusive. There is an analogy, an imagery in particular, which describes our situation as someone who is locked alone in a glass chamber. We cannot get out of that. We are in a chamber, we are in a room where there is nothing apart from our own interpretation of reality. We have our opinions, we are our belief templates, which is the expression used by David Foster Wallace. All these are valid, and so all of them are false. And if they are false, they are not able to move what I will call the center of our affection. We are kind of static in our own opinion. What we esteem and what we love in life is not really challenged by the certainty of something within reality. And even Christians are exposed, because we are moderns, okay? We are Christians, but we live in a modern world. And as Christians, we are exposed to the same skepticism. And that's indeed where Newman starts helping us, because back in the middle of the 19th century, Newman somehow prophesied that the teaching that there is no positive truth is gaining substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Religion is not an objective fact, it's a sentiment, it's a taste, it's a belief template, if you want. And I do think that Newman, by, in a way, looking at this drama, which is a drama of modernity, was himself living as a modern man. That's not just something that which I believe, but it's something which Pope Benedict XVI said when he came to Britain in 2010, and he described Newman as a modern man who lived the whole problem of modernity. And if we sum up as the problem of modernity, their relationship with reality, the lack of certainty, the impossibility to get a meaning, to obtain a meaning certain about reality, in this sense, Newman is a modern man. And what I'm going to do tonight, if you want, is to go through what is Newman's journey of conversion, which, as Pope Benedict said, again, the same journey, it's a journey in three different paths, three different conversions. So I'm going to follow this threefold journey of conversion, following this particular idea, which is summed up in what he wrote on his grave. As you know, it is the famous words, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem. The Latin says, from the shadows and the images to truth. But as Jan Caro, who is one of the greatest experts of Newman, said, this can be more appropriately translated out of unreality into reality. So the journey of conversion of John Henry Newman, which is a lifelong journey, never stopped, is at the end of the day a journey of conversion to reality. So what I'm going to do in the next half an hour, 40 minutes, is to retrace, to follow the steps of this journey, taking particular care to that opening challenge which the life and the words of David Foster Wallace gave to us. Can we really know anything certain about reality? Can we recognize the presence of God coming to save us and rescue us from the middle of a blizzard? And I think the time we are living, I think it's very appropriate. We are living in the middle of a blizzard. And I do think the whole issue is about kneeling down and then waiting for someone to come to rescue us. But unless we get to the meaning of that, we don't understand what's going on. And in this sense, Newman is a great master, and Newman is a great saint, and Newman is a great friend. Not just because Newman wrote very important books about this particular issue. In particular, he wrote a book which is called The Grammar of Assent, which is all about that, essentially. It's about how can we get certainty about the most important things in life. But tonight, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about the theology of John Henry Newman. I'm going to more talk about his own particular experience, which is an experience informed by his own theological reasoning, because in Newman, the thoughts and the life are connected. There is no division between life and philosophy, between life and theology. But tonight I'm going, if you want, to focus on the life, but not the life just in a biographical sense, but in the life in terms of this threefold journey of conversion to reality. This journey of conversion to reality begins in 1816, at the age of 15, when Newman is in the middle of a crisis. In a sense, there are many similarities, I believe, between the crisis of the beginning of the 19th century and the crisis we are living in many different aspects, not just Brexit and so on, because there was a kind of one of the first Brexit that Britain did, but there was also a very deep financial crisis, and Newman's father was a banker, if you want, the equivalent of a banker, and in 1816, after the crisis of the Napoleonic War, Newman was left alone in his school while his father was trying to put their life back to business in the middle of a crisis. Newman was alone, and also Newman, decades later, in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that he had 4 important illnesses, and at each stage of this illness, he made a step in his life. And this, if you want, is the first step. He was left alone, sick, with his family and security that he had known before in ruins. After, if you want, a golden age of his life, everything was in ruins, suddenly, unexpectedly. That's why you also find many analogies with what we're living at the moment. And Newman, in this situation, was forced to experience the fragility of reality, if you want, the inconsistency of material reality. But paradoxically, this experience of inconsistency, of fragility of reality, of the reality we see, became for him a great occasion of conversion. The conversion which, following what Pope Benedict said, is, if in order of priority, the most important conversion of John Henry Newman. And this conversion is the conversion to the reality of God. And I can read a couple of quotes because I think they're very clear. I believe that the inward conversion, which is the one he had at the age of 15, of which I was conscious, had some influence on my opinions in making me rest in the thought of two and two only, absolute and luminously self-evident beings, myself and my Creator. So you see that there are only two evidences in life. One, if you want, is the Cartesian I, myself, the fact that I exist, but the other is the evidence of God. And he is a God who is somehow beyond reality, beyond material phenomena, if you want. The material reality, the reality which is around him, is very, if you want, ugly. Is a reality which is absolutely not very attractive. But beyond that reality, Newman perceives the existence of someone else. And the bridge, if you want, that allows Newman to get to this, if you want, more real reality, which is the reality of God, is his own conscience, his own I. And that's what basically talks about in a very beautiful novel, which is called Callista. It talks about the experience of the main character, this young, beautiful Greek girl who gets converted. But this first conversion is not a conversion to Christianity. It is a conversion to the existence, to the evidence, to the self-evidence of a creator. I feel that God within my heart. I feel myself in his presence. You may tell me that this dictate is a mere law of my nature, but I cannot understand this. It is instead the echo of a person speaking to me. My nature feels towards it as towards a person. An echo implies a voice, a speaker, and that speaker I love and I fear. So we see how Newman, as a modern man, in front of the inconsistency and if you want, ugliness of reality, through his conscience is able to recognize this inner reality. And this is really what the first conversion is about. And here I think it's useful to quote again Pope Benedict XVI, which describes this first conversion in the following terms. Before his conversion, what appeared genuinely real to him as to the men of his and our day is the empirical, matter that can be grasped. This is the reality according to which one finds one's bearings. The real is what can be grasped. It is the things that can be calculated and taken in one's hand. That's the way we think, whether we believe it, that's the way we think. But in this conversion, Newman recognized that it is exactly the other way around. That God in the soul, man's spiritual identity, constitute what is genuinely real, what counts. These are much more real, again, than objects that can be grasped. This conversion was a Copernican revolution. So you see, the first conversion is the first conversion to reality. To, if you want, the true essence of reality, the more real reality, the reality in its truest sense. This is, I believe, and Pope Benedict believes, the most important conversion, but it is just the beginning of a journey. It is the beginning of a journey which will require later on another important step, which is a step that he made with suffering, again through suffering, through sacrifices, and as we're going to see very soon, in coincidence with a very grave illness. And this second step had to do with this separation, this detachment that he somehow lived during his first conversion. Because the risk of perceiving that the reality that matters is God, and the reality which around us, the material reality, is inconsistent. This position, which to a certain extent is true, but on its own carries with it itself a very important risk. And this risk is this risk of dualism, of division, which is a division between material reality, which can be grasped with our reason, with our calculation, but also with our affection, and then the other reality, which can be, if you want, grasped with the eye of faith. To put this dualism in a different way, it's a dualism between faith and between reason, between the relation with God and the relation with reality. And Newman lived this risk of dualism for the next, if you want, 15, 20 years of his life. And he lived them, first of all, from, if you want, intellectual point of view, because when he came to Oxford after this initial conversion, he encountered two philosophical and theological positions that somehow defended, gave rational justification to this dualism. And these were, in Newman's terms, the evangelicalism on the one hand and liberalism on the other hand. And to simplify a bit what Newman meant by that, there are some similarities what these two things are nowadays, but at that day in particular, evangelicalism for Newman was the reduction of faith to a sentiment, to a feeling, and liberalism was instead the reduction of faith to an opinion. These seem quite different from one another. Even in political terms, we could say that evangelicalism is more to the right, liberalism perhaps is more to the left, depending in what country you are nowadays. But yet the assumptions, the philosophical but also the existential assumptions are very similar, as we're going to see. And to spend a few words in particular on evangelicalism, which is, if you want, the form of Christianity that Newman encountered at the beginning, because his teachers at school were evangelical, and this first conversion that he lived at the age of 15 was an evangelical conversion. And when he went to Oxford at the beginning, he was fascinated because he found their correspondence, this particular approach to Christianity. And this approach to Christianity essentially is, as we're going to read here, is the idea that true Christianity is shown in a state of consciousness. And then he goes on, you consider we are in danger. In this day you insist not on faith and obedience, but rather we are considering not these kind of things as barren orthodoxy, and yet we believe that what is very important instead is what is called having a spiritual state of heart. I find this very important because what Newman is talking about here is his own first conversion to a certain extent, is a spiritual state of the heart, which in a sense was for him the beginning of everything. And that's something which I'm going to say again and again in the course of this talk, which Newman is able always to add something to his past, to complete what he was living. Even in the journey of conversion from, for instance, in this case, from evangelicalism to Catholicism to a certain extent, he did not get rid of evangelicalism. The journey of conversion of Newman, which is, as I said, the journey of conversion to reality, is not to oppose previous discoveries with new ones. It's rather to complete, to add on what has been already discovered. As in this particular case, this idea that faith is a sentiment, and faith is a sentiment, but it's not just a sentiment. And you must step by step in Oxford study to develop and overcome this risk of evangelical reduction. Doesn't matter what we believe, it doesn't matter the object of faith, doctrine, doesn't matter ethics, obedience. What matters is just our spiritual condition. The opposite, if you want, of that, but that's not really an opposite, is the reduction of faith as an opinion. And I think that we can read Newman on that because it's very clear. Liberalism in religion is a doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but the one creed is good as another. Or to put it in a different way, this elementary position of this new philosophy, liberalism, which is now so threatening, is that in all things we must go by reason and in nothing by faith. The things are known and are to be received so far as that can be proved. Why I'm saying that the two positions are similar, because both of them assume a very similar dualism between faith and reason. On the one hand, what matters is just faith, but faith conceived as something which has nothing to say on reality, on material reality, on the way we live, on the things that for us are important, or what we do, on the meaning of the things that happen to us. This faith has nothing to do with that. Faith in a, if you want, Kantian sense, is just a tool to connect with this God who is beyond reality. On the other hand, the emphasis is just on religion, on reason. Religion has something to say on matters of reality, has something to say on ethics and politics or whatever, but the criteria to assess it is purely reason. Again, faith and reason are not connected, and that's the other big risk. Newman, in these Oxford years, overcame gradually this division from an intellectual point of view, but what was more difficult for him was to overcome this dualism from an existential point of view. And this dualism, I believe, was overcome finally in one momentous trip which he made in 1832 and 1833, when he got at the end of a very intense period of work, and he felt like he had a strong need of a holiday. He almost had a nervous breakdown, so he decided to go on a journey to Italy for the first time with a couple of friends. And this was, I will skip the life in between but you can always, there are very good biographies about Newman, so I'm now jumping off, if you want, 10, 15 years to 1832, from 1816-17 to 1832-33. So I was saying Newman comes to Italy, and for the first time encounters Catholicism, the reality of Catholicism, which for him before then was simply popism, something which he despised and that had left, as he said, a stain on his imagination. Since his young age, Catholicism, being a Catholic, was something very, very bad. Even not just the level of reason, but the level of imagination and the level of the feeling. It's something which, as Newman was saying, the Apologia had really something to do with the way, with the kind of prejudices and biases that he had, rather than with his own particular reasoning. He was, to a certain extent, disgusted by the Catholic faith, by the veneration of the Pope, by what looked to him superstition, but at the same time was very attracted. And we know that it came into a crisis. This encounter with the reality of the church made him his position a bit difficult. It was the beginning of some doubts, because he was very attracted in particular by how popular was the Catholic faith in Italy, which was something that he couldn't see very much in Britain. In Britain, what he saw was a faith that was somehow related with the establishment, with the big universities, but it didn't really feel to him as something very popular, very alive. And that's instead the feeling that he had in Italy in that momentous trip. What Newman does in this situation, I would say, he flees reality. He flees material reality. He flees the reality of his life and decides to refuse to go back to Britain with his friends, and decides to go along with a servant to Sicily and do what can properly be called a grand tour. You know that in the 19th century there were many romantic writers and artists that would come to Italy, and especially looking for the remnants of the Greek temples and the Greek art, and they will go along for months and months. Goethe did that, Byron did that, but it was a kind of very fashionable thing, very romantic, if you want. Newman is a romantic, and the big risk of romanticism, I think, is very similar to what we've been talking about so far. Romanticism somehow puts this trust in the present of our reality and looks for hope in the past, in a sort of idealized past, sublime, with the sublime of art. That's what Newman did. He went to look for the beauty of nature. He fell on what we will call a sentimental, a subjectivist temptation. It was, if you want, the last time of his life that he fell into this problem, into this risk. But again, God had some plans for him, because while he was traveling along in Sicily, he fell ill again. What we will later call as the second big illness of his life, which corresponded to, again, a great moment of conversion. At this moment of conversion, essentially, which was the end of a journey, which was the journey of the first years in Oxford until 1832, 1833, was the journey of a conversion to reality as the place, as the theater, if you want, where God acts. God is real because God is real, God is the true essence of reality, but God has created reality and God interacts with reality. And that means, and I'm here really quoting Newman, that it's impossible to live a faith which does not become an obedience, which does not become a relationship, an engagement with the material reality, which doesn't deny the fact that material reality is somehow inconsistent. But at the same time, material reality is the paradoxical place where God is interacting and where God demands to be followed. And that's in fact what Newman will understand very clearly in that second conversion. He will say later, he will recall later on the Apologia that he was sure that he was not going to die because he had some work to do in England. In this particular moment, he realized that faith for him was not just a personal relationship with God, lived in the intimacy of his conscience. Although that's very important, but a faith lived within the intimacy of one's conscience compels to live in reality. As we can see here, how there is a second act of realism, a second conversion to reality. Faith compels action. Faith requires obedience. And not casually, during his journey back to the UK, he will write this, of course, the very beautiful hymn, Lead, Kindly Light. And that's, if you want, the motto, the epitome of this position. I'm no longer the one in charge to choose and see my path, to live my relation with God in a sort of a subjectivistic way, and then use my own particular preferences to act in life. No, faith allows me to recognize a path, to follow a light. And that's why Newman will say the whole of duty and work of a Christian is made up of these two parts: faith and obedience, looking into Jesus, if you want the first conversion, but acting according to his will. And what Newman does in the second, after the second conversion, is really to become an instrument of God, a character of God, if you want, in the drama of reality. And again, this is a conversion to reality. There is a big risk, which I see very much in many Christians, and often within myself, to think that the world is very bad, and the world is Christian, is now post-Christian, is no longer Christian, so what we need to do is somehow to protect ourselves from the world. That's not what Newman did. After especially 1832 and 1833, Newman engaged with the world, engaged in the battle with the world, giving his own life to this. And the sort of concrete translation of this position, the concrete embodiment of this position was the Oxford movement. It will require me a long lecture to explain what is the Oxford movement. And the Oxford movement, just to give you an idea, was a very big social event in the history of Britain from the 1830s to the late 1840s and beyond. The impact that it had on the architecture, culture, politics, and religion of England in particular, but not just England, is without, I think, parallels in the 19th century. It was really a big social movement of people. Newman was leading this movement together with other two friends, but there were hundreds and indeed thousands of people spread all across the country. And what were these people doing? What was the mission of this Oxford movement about? Essentially the discoveries that Newman had made through his initial stages of the journey. Again, to simplify them a bit, the first one is the principle of dogma, which, to paraphrase, means that faith is knowledge of something real, objective. It is neither a feeling or an opinion. Faith gives you a knowledge of something which is real, and therefore gives you also guidance how to live with the reality. And second, the idea that there is a place which is called the church, with sacraments and rites, which are the channels of invisible grace. And you may wonder, what's the difference between this and the Catholic faith? Newman is an Anglican here, is not a Catholic yet, and I would say not really, nothing essentially. What Newman is doing in the 1830s and early 1840s is essentially to build up a Catholic church with a Catholic theology. There is only a little difference, little but crucial, which is the fact that this church, this real place within the world where one can live Christianity, was not something present from something other, something outside, like something far away in Italy with the Pope, not a very nice person even in this particular time. Indeed, the third great idea of the Oxford movement is that the Roman Church is corrupted and the Pope is almost an antichrist. In fact, what Newman is trying to do essentially is to prevent people from being propelled into popery. We need to build up a church which is Catholic, but it's something that we do. I personally find this very fascinating because I also fall into the trap to think that the church is something which I make based on my, if you want, theological knowledge or whatever, or even my ethical assumptions on or what the images I have, what I think the church should be. And that's essentially what Newman is doing in the 1830s, to build up a Catholic Church better than the Roman Church, which is corrupted, it's full of superstition, full of Italians doing not very pleasant things. So I can understand very well why Newman was trying to do something better than that. That's what he tries to do in the late 30s. And this is the moment when Newman slowly begins to travel, to journey towards the third conversion, the most difficult one, if you want. We've seen the first conversion, the conversion to God, as something which is the most real thing of reality, even more real than materiality. The second conversion is that this transcendental God, yet participates with reality, has created reality, has even incarnated himself into reality, and so demands action within the reality. But the third, the most difficult one, is the fact that there is a place, there is a reality within this material reality which has somehow a priority, which is something other than us, which is something objective. It doesn't come from our own efforts, ethical, theological, or spiritual, but it's something which is recognized and followed without the sacrifice that it demands. And again, this conversion, which is the most difficult one, as I said, because as Pope Benedict declared, it required him to give up almost everything that was dear and precious to him: possession, profession, academic rank, family ties, and many friends. There are many people who got to the point where Newman got in the 1830s in the history of this island in the past 2 centuries, but very few had the guts, if you want, the courage to do what Newman did, to give up everything. And what we're trying to do next 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so is to try to understand why Newman did that. In a moment where his theology was Catholic, with very little difference, but 99.99% Newman is Catholic in the 1830s. And again, the whole issue, the whole challenge that Newman is facing with this construction of the Oxford movement, with a church that I'm building up, has to do with the contrast between reality and unreality. Again, has to do with realism, with an act of realism, with an act of obedience to the reality. That's how what Newman writes in the late 30s about the challenge that he's living in these years. A great experiment is going on, whether Anglo-Catholicism, this idea of again, regardless of the cultural implications, but of a church which I make as I want, according to the cultural and even psychological features that I prefer. This kind of idea of a church, whether this kind of idea of a church has a root, a foundation, a consistency, or whether it be a sham. I hold it to be quite impossible. You see again the emphasis on reality. Unless it be real, that it can maintain its ground. It must fall into pieces. This is a day in which mere theories will not pass current. If you be a mere theory, it will not work. We are in 1839, around 1839. It will take Newman 6 years to accept that the Anglo-Catholicism to which he's giving his life to the building of this Catholicism, does not have a foundation. It's not really real. And there are a few blows, and I'm quoting Newman here, that somehow are destroying this sham, are revealing the inconsistency of this theory. I don't have the time to delve into all these blows. I will just quote one in particular, which is one which seems a bit difficult because it depends on a Latin sentence that he read in these years, which is this, currus judica orbis terrarum, but I will paraphrase it a bit. What Newman understood while he was studying the early church, the early history of Christianity, the 3rd or 4th century AD, that at this age, that somehow the church was pure, according to Newman. It was not yet corrupted as it would have been. But even at this particular stage, the certainty of the Catholic Church did not rely on the tradition, on the piety, or the coherence of the members, and not even, this is crucial for Newman, it seems so paradoxical to him, it was absolutely orthodox, okay? But this certainty did not even rely on the orthodoxy of the doctrine, on the correctness of the doctrine. All these were absolutely very important, but the certainty of the church, in this particular case, the Orbis Terrarum, which is the community of the church, according to St. Augustine, relied on the conviction of belonging, of being part of the real, present, living body of Christ. I was completely struck by that, because I started to think, so what's really the point, what's really the priority of my Christian position? To come out with the perfect doctrine, with the perfect ethical realization of this doctrine, or to belong to something alive? And that's really the whole point, this little seed of doubt which begins to grow into Newman's heart. There are also other blows that somehow start to reveal to him that this Anglo-Catholicism is a wonderful idea, but it was not real. And Newman was, as I said, a romantic. Newman was, if you want, idealistic in many respects. So for him was required a big sacrifice, this idea to yield to reality, to accept reality. And yet, it was not so easy. It was a struggle. They went on. And Newman tried to do, during these 6 crucial years, was, as he says here, to pinch himself to be sure that he was not sleeping or dreaming. He doesn't want really to accept what he's starting to realize. So what he does, he starts to challenge. He becomes quite anti-popist. And it's interesting because at the moment where he's close to the Catholic Church, it is the time where he produces a couple of quite anti-Catholic sermons, and one of them challenges the Catholic Church, saying, Rome must change first of all in the spirit. I must see more sanctity now than I do at the present. If the Catholics want to convert England, let them go barefooted into our manufacturing towns, let them be pelted and trampled on. It's quite, I wouldn't say angry, but you can perceive a bit of a satisfaction with what's going on. It doesn't really want to become a Catholic. We are in the beginning of the 19th century. In the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, to be a Catholic was still illegal. The Emancipation Act was very recent, but just as nowadays in England, I've been living many years in England, I love the country, but it's quite clear in this country to be a Catholic somehow is to betray a bit one's own identity. To be a Catholic is somehow insinuating a little doubt that you are not completely English, that you are not completely British, you are somehow betraying something. And Newman is at the top of the establishment. The idea for him to become a Catholic is simply science fiction at this stage of his life. It's simply impossible. That's why he keeps pinching himself. And what also I find very fascinating is that he's not just taking account of himself at this stage of his life, but he's thinking also about his friends. Because he knows that if he leaves the Catholic Church, then there will be many people, leaves to the Catholic Church, it will be such a trauma that many people will lose the faith. I was talking with a few Anglican friends of mine, whom I greatly admired, and they were saying, but we need to stay where we are because we are in a way a light for many people. And I understand this in a way. This is the same kind of challenge that Newman was living in the early 40s of the 19th century, okay? And yet, reality, this important reality, which is the theater of God, starts answering to his challenges. And in particular, it's quite fascinating, and while he's challenging the Catholic Church to send the missionaries barefooted, this is exactly what the Catholic Church is doing, because in his very years, we have some people like this man here, who is called Father Domenico Barberi, who is coming barefooted in England, preaching with his very poor English accent, the gospel to the English all around the country. And Newman is very struck by Domenico Barberi and his friends, but also is very struck deeper how God is answering in reality to his questions. And then we can go back to this little story by David Foster Wallace. You kneel down and you ask to be saved, and then something happens. And Newman felt challenged by this. He started to say, I need to trust the signs that God is sending to me. And indeed, there is a beautiful letter which he writes, perhaps I put it there, no, it's not here, but trust me, that's what he says. He says, I have been praying for 5 years, God to guide me. And he says even more precisely, to God to send me a light, to guide me, the lead kind of light of his Sicilian years. And everything that is happening is a confirmation, is an answer to my questions. You see that for Newman, faith is something real. It has to do with what happens, with reality. It has to do with the Eskimos coming to save you in the blizzard, not just with the theological orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, which is of course very important. And Newman was also a great doctor of the Church and again a great thinker and a great philosopher. But at the end of the day, that's something that he says in the Apologia. What made possible for him to make the final step was not an intellectual reasoning. All the intellectual reasoning and thinking had led into a step, but the final jump was done with a different way. And this final jump was paradoxically done because of the importance of the first and the second conversion. On the one hand, the certainty of one's own relation with God, who is enlightening in the intimacy of my conscience, but at the same time is also asking for obedience. So to a certain extent, Newman jumps into the Catholic Church. I wouldn't say that it's a Pascalian jump, it's because it's not irrational, but the rationality is not because he has understood everything. The rationality consists in the realism, in the fact that he has recognized that the Eskimos that were sent to him in the blizzard have been sent by someone. The signs that have been sent to him in the early 40s, have been sent to him by someone, the same person that he encountered for the first time in his young age, that he began to follow during the 30s after the Sicilian trip with all the Oxford movement. And the same person, the same voice was asking him to make this step. And he trusted the voice, and it's on the 7th of October 1844, as you know, 445, as you know, Newman writes to Domenico Barbari and asks him to receive the Catholic Church. As you know, the first years of Newman as a Catholic were awful, were very, very difficult. And I just read this quote because this is a quote which is very dear to my heart, because this is how he describes the first years in the Catholic Church, where he was not exactly welcome with a nice party. How dry was my first year at Maryvale in Birmingham, when I was in the gaze of so many eyes at Oscott, as if I some wild, incomprehensible beast caught by the hunter, and a spectacle for Dr. Wiseman to exhibit to strangers, as he himself being the hunter who captured it. And again, as a Protestant, I felt my religion dreary, but not my life. As a Catholic, my life dreary, not my religion. I love Newman especially for this sacrifice that he had to endure in the Catholic Church. It took him at least 15, 20 years to the Catholic Church to recognize who exactly Newman was. And there were years in which he had to face many incomprehensions. He was even sued by a priest and described as an heretic. He also tried to do a lot of different things, like a university in Ireland, and he failed. These were difficult years. But what was the point of all of that? What was the point of this final act of conversion? What was the, if you want, the gain of this loss? Paraphrasing the title of another novel, The Loss and Gain. What was the gain? And the gain has again to do with reality, and more specifically with one's own relation with reality. In the Catholic Church, I recognized at once a reality which was quite a new thing with me. I was sensible that at this point, I was not making for myself a church by an effort of thought. I needed not to make an act of faith in her. I had not painfully to force myself into a position, but my mind fell back upon itself in relaxation and peace, and I gazed at her almost passively as a great objective fact. So we see how even this third journey of conversion, this third step, this third stage, is again a conversion to reality, to the recognition that there is a reality, an objective reality, with all its problems, with all its corruption, with all its division. I think in 2020 we have plenty of them. That's why I'm so grateful to Newman, because I'm not scandalized at all by the problems in the church or the division or whatever, because Newman himself said that this is, if you want, natural for a living body like the church. So I'm absolutely at peace with that. But at the same time, despite or even through these all contradictions of the Catholic Church, this Catholic Church is the real place where God is present. That's the place, that's the reality where God has decided to, as Newman said, interfere in the human affairs. There are two aspects in particular that were very important for Newman at this stage. One, of course, is the Blessed Sacrament, which for him, again, was an objective fact. The encounter with the Blessed Sacrament, which he knew notionally before, theoretically, intellectually, but the encounter, the physical, experiential, existential encounter with the sacrament for him was something absolutely mind-blowing. And the other real element of the Catholic Church what struck him was this sense of communion. And I will read a quote from Loss and Gain to explain what I mean by that. It seemed, and this is the moment where the protagonist of Loss and Gain converts, or at least begins to convert, begins to experience the communion of the saints. It seemed as the kiss of his friend had conveyed into his own soul the enthusiasm which his words has betokened. He felt himself possessed, and you can really feel Newman talking about himself. He knew not how, by a high superhuman power, which seemed able to push through mountains and to walk the sea. We winter around him, and I think we are living a bit of a winter as well. He fell within like the springtide, when all is new and bright. He perceived that he had found, and that's crucial, the springtide is not outside the reality. It's not beyond. It's not the hope of a future world of a transcendental reality where one day we will all be happy. No, it's something within this reality. He perceived that he had found in reality what he had never sought, because he had never known what he was, but what he had ever wanted, a soul sympathetic with his own. He felt he was no longer alone in the world. It was this, he asked himself, the communion of saints. This communion of saints was for Newman the kind of one of the greatest signs that the church is something alive, is something real. So to sum up, and I'm now really moving to the conclusion, to sum up this journey of realism, to journey of conversion to reality, I can briefly quote the Pope made again, because everything I've been saying to a certain extent is an attempt to delve into what the Pope suggested when he came in Britain in 2010. First conversion is the conversion to God as the maker of reality. So the perception of a reality of a creator, the recognition that nature, reality is created and therefore that there's a creator. The second conversion, as I said, is the conversion to the material reality, the theater where God acts and where man knows with certainty and obeys to God. And this, as the Pope said, is essentially an overcoming of the subjectivism of the evangelical position. And finally, the conversion to the reality of the church, which is the place where God is present, really present. It is to this church, Berry said, which Newman loved and to whose mission he devoted his entire life with all the sacrifices. And I think, again, even in our particular situation, the love of the church was something that Newman held so dear to his heart and for which he suffered so much. That's why I personally suffer a lot when I see all this, if you want, opposition to the church. I mean, without any kind of love. I mean, that's not absolutely the experience of Newman. Newman was a free man. Newman was very brave, and Newman was not certainly clerical, but at the same time, he did have a great love for the church, and he did sacrifice this love most of his life. What, however, and this is really the conclusion, what, however, I find so fascinating this journey of realism that we have seen, which is a journey to adhesion, if you want, adhering to reality, is that it's a journey in which all the different steps, all the different stages are not, as I was saying before, abandoned or forgotten or neglected or denied, but are in a way added and complemented. And I will read two quotes, one from Newman and one from Bob Benedict, that I think clarify well what I mean. Those great and burning truths, which I learned when a boy, 15 years old, the experience of God as the maker of reality, I have found impressed upon my heart with fresh and ever-increasing force by the Holy Roman Church. That church had added to that simple evangelicalism, but he has obscured, diluted, enfeebled nothing of it. On the contrary, I found a power, a resource, a comfort, a consolation in our Lord's real, again, presence in communion in his divine and human person, which all good Catholics indeed have. And that's why for Newman to change is to be perfect. That's why for Newman to convert to reality, which is painful, was to live through a reality and think about how our reality is changing, how much our reality changed in the past year. To convert to the reality, which means to be available to change, is necessary if one wants to remain himself. Newman was a person converting, a person being transformed, and thus he always remained and became even more himself. So all this journey of realism that we have seen today, that we have traced today, is necessary to regain our own self, to regain in particular that original experience which Newman had at the age of 15, which is this beautiful, simple relationship with God in one's life. So my talk is over, but before we open to the floor, if you don't mind, I would like to go back to the opening story of this blizzard where salvation is apparently found. And we can see that the whole Newman's life is a witness, not just a wonderful and sophisticated intellectual defense, but also a witness to what happens to the people who are available to recognize the salvation of God in the blizzard, to open the eyes to the salvation of God. And with this, face any kind of circumstances without fear. And so, as a final thing, I will conclude with 3 minutes video. We started with a video and a light green composition, so we'll conclude with another video, which is a very short selection from the Biglietto speech, which Newman gave in Rome, where Stefan is at the moment, when he finally was recognized as a cardinal. Finally, his greatness was recognized by everyone after many decades of incomprehension. And if you want, I think that there is no more persuasive answer to the blizzard of David Foster Wallace than the Biglietto speech of John Henry Newman. I do think that is also giving hope to us that we are living in another blizzard, and so often we are starting to be afraid, and so often we start to forget that salvation does not come from us, but comes from outside, and we just have to stand up and see.
First of all, then, I am led to speak of the wonder and profound gratitude which came upon me at the condescension and love towards me of the Holy Father in singling me out for so immense an honour. It was a great surprise. I had passed through many trials, but they were over, and now the end of all things had almost come to me, and I was at peace. And was it possible that after all I had lived through so many years for this? In a long course of years, I have made many mistakes, but what I trust that I may claim is this: an honest intention, an absence of private ends, a temper of obedience, a willingness to be corrected, a dread of error, a desire to serve Holy Church. And I rejoice to say, to one great mischief, I have from the first opposed myself. For 50 years I have resisted to the best of my powers the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another. And this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous. Since religion is so personal a peculiarity, and so private a possession, it is in no sense the bond of society. Everywhere, that goodly framework of society, which is the creation of Christianity, is throwing off Christianity. By the end of the century, unless the Almighty interferes, it will be forgotten. It must be borne in mind that there is much in this theory which is good and true. For example, not to say more, the precepts of justice, truthfulness, and benevolence. There never was a device of the enemy so cleverly framed and with such promise of success. Such is the state of things, and it is well that it should be realized by all of us. But it must not be supposed for a moment that I am afraid of it. I lament it deeply, because I foresee that it may be the ruin of many souls. But I have no fear at all that it really can do aught of serious harm to the Word of God and to Holy Church. Christianity has been too often in what seemed deadly peril, that we should fear for it any new trial now. On the other hand, what is commonly a great surprise when it is witnessed is the particular mode by which, in the event, Providence rescues and saves his elect inheritance. Commonly, the Church has nothing more to do than to go on in her own proper duties, in confidence and peace, to stand still and to see the salvation of God.